And welcome back. Now, South Africans must prepare for a 15.63% price increase of the cost of electricity from the 1st of April this year. The North Gauteng High Court granted Eskom permission to recover an amount of 10 billion rand for costs incurred by the power utility in the production of electricity from the public. Now, Eskom says that the money will help to improve its financial sustainability. And the National Energy Regulator of South Africa, or NERSA, they say that this order does not stop them from proceeding with the case that has commenced at the Supreme Court of Appeal against the High Court's judgment in July last year. And joining us to discuss this further is Nhlanhla Gumede, who is from the Energy Regulator, NERSA. Mr. Gumede, thanks for your time. Welcome to Morning Live.
Good morning, Sakina, and good morning to the viewers.
So let's just start with the increases, Mr. Gumede. Please explain to us exactly how the specific increase was decided upon, because we're talking about various, grants that have been acceded to by NERSA for Eskom. So please just talk us through those.
Okay, just to explain that NERSA, in respect of Eskom, it sets contrary to believe, we set a revenue. So, and unfortunately, we use a forecasting model. That's the so-called MYPD, the multi-year pricing determination, which is a forward-looking instrument. But what we then do every year is that we then, because anyway, any forward projection is based on assumptions, we then say every year, how did we perform? How did Eskom perform against the assumptions that were underpinning that forward model? Then we then say that that's the process called the RCA, the regulatory clearing account. So we've got two processes: the MYPD, like we are actually right now we are entering into the final year of the MYPD4. But that is a multi-year, which is a 3-year thing. But every year, then there's a reopener called the RCA. So what happened is that we've had, unfortunately, a number of RCAs going back as far as 2014, 2015, 2016, that were reviewed and set aside and remitted back to NERSA. And also, we had an RCA for 2018 and 19, for which Eskom was granted a right to submit a supplementary RCA. So that's what is that's the 6 billion that is mentioned in the statement. So then further to that, because of whatever may have happened in the past, we actually have a dispute with Eskom, which is why we're in court, and there is a 23 billion rand that's being contested, and the judge then ordered. We then settled basically to for a 10 billion rand settlement order. So those are the revenues, but it's not tariff. So those are the revenues that are allowed to Eskom.
So, speaking of those court cases, there are, of course, a few between Eskom and the regulator. Will you just please give us clarity on this specific one?
Okay, maybe to put this one in context, and I always want to say it's important that we remember that we are actually dealing with legacy issues. So there were decisions that were made at the start of this MYPD4. Decisions that on both and mistakes were made on both sides. Firstly, as I indicate, that we set revenue. So revenue is supposed to be calculated based on costs, expended costs. Now, the question that you have to ask is whether the expended costs were they prudently incurred or efficiently incurred. But once you've gone through that first hurdle, then you then set a revenue. But in that decision, was being made in terms of the MYPD4, then government said, look, we're going to grant Eskom 23 billion rands per annum for 3 years. That is basically for the amounts that were coinciding with the MYPD4. And NERSA treated that amount, that government grant, in a particular way. Now, the issue there is whether that was correct or not correct. Now, the court case is not about the correctness or incorrectness of that. The idea would have been that that decision on whether this is correct and should have been treated in a particular way should have been handled differently. So the court cases are, in fact, a dispute that says this the decision on what should have happened should have been remitted back to NERSA, because as a statutory body, in terms of the body that has been mandated to set tariffs, it is the one that says, yes, if you've made an error, Mr. Regulator, go and fix your error. But so that is a dispute. It's not so much the dispute of whether there was an error made or not.
So, Mr. Gumede, the public looks on at this at a time when, as a result of the pandemic, economic woes in the country have been exacerbated. And the woes of the power utility have been well documented. Just recently, one was said, you were reading about Eskom wasting almost R1 billion on a block of flats, for example, that hasn't been completed. And then you also look at the cost overruns of power stations like Kusile and Medupi. All of these things, those are just but to mention three of a myriad of others. And the public basically looks on at this and they ask, how exactly are these determinations made when we talk about the production cost of electricity in the country? And why should the public then seemingly have to pick up the slack for whatever mistakes are made by the power utility?
Thanks for that question, Sakina, because it presents us an opportunity to explain it properly. You see, the challenge, the reason why I started with this issue that says, firstly, NERSA sets the revenue, and revenue has got two components to it: price and sales. Now, it was not a mistake to actually consider both price. So revenue is price times sales. So you have to ask, but when we then say, even with this revenue, Eskom comes to the director and says, I seek this revenue because I've expended these costs. But the question that we have to ask is that, did you actually have to expend those costs? And you've rightly pointed out, there are many examples out there of cost overruns, of all of the things that may still emerge once the Zondo Commission is complete and all of the other SIU investigations are done. We'll then be able to maybe to have a proper estimate of what the true costs overruns are. Now, the issue, though, is that we work based on facts. So Eskom presented numbers and it said we expended this cost. And we sit back and we say, yes, you may have expended the costs, but perhaps we did not expend them correctly. Now, the judges also would then say to us, look, you've got a particular methodology. So, for instance, one example I actually like to use is that one of the costs, for instance, in terms of coal, we actually then, in terms of, say, coal costs have got a cost of transporting coal. And the most cost-effective way of transporting coal is via conveyor belt. So you've got a mine that is linked close to a power station, and coal is supposed to be transported on that conveyor belt. But there's been decisions where coal has been transported on road, perhaps at 3 or 4 times the cost it would have cost to actually transport by road. Now, the regulator ordinarily cannot tell a licensee how to run its business. But what the regulator should be able then to say is to say, well, we recognize that you expended these costs, but the most efficient mode of transport would have been this mode, so we will recognize this mode. But unfortunately, that must be included in the methodology. If it's not included in the methodology, a departure by the regulator on its own is deemed to be irrational. And that's where we are sitting in court today. So we've got a lot of these decisions that we all know about, of costs that are 3 times. I mean, Medupi, for instance, was supposed to be built for 50 billion, and it ended up being built for 250 billion. It's even not complete. But those costs were truly incurred. But the question is, should consumers be paying for it? But the issue here is that unless you set up a methodology such that you can be able to exclude certain costs rationally, and the licensee knows about that, that is the challenge that we are facing, which is why this regulatory reform that we need to embark on now.
How far along are we on that road? Because I think it becomes very important, Mr. Gumede, using the example that you've just cited of cost overruns. And we've seen, again, in the Wilge situation, that's the block of flats that was built, whereby someone at Eskom made a decision irrational as it was, unlawful as it was, to continue paying for something way beyond what it actually cost. And they got away with it until, of course, they didn't. And, a stop was put to it and someone was arrested because of that. However, how many other of those type of decisions are being made at the power utility, have perhaps been made in the past, that the taxpayer now has to pick up the tab for? This regulation obviously is something that is desperately needed so that the consumer can stop having to bear the brunt of maladministration, malfeasance, and in some instances just sheer incompetence.
Well, firstly, I think I do have to start by saying, in answering your questions of when is this going to start, is to say it's unfortunate that you are trying to correct mistakes in the world that is very different to the world in which those mistakes were made. Because clearly, when those mistakes were made, perhaps the electricity price was 40 cents or 50 cents per kilowatt hour. It's going now to way over 134 cents per kilowatt hour. I'm talking about the wholesale price. That's not what you're going to pay as a consumer at home, because there are other costs that are going to be added to that on top of that. But the issue here is that, unfortunately, hindsight is always the best science. So we're sitting here and saying, what is it that we've learned? And luckily, this is the last year 2021-22 is the last year of the MYPD4. So we have an opportunity now to change, taking into account all of the changes that are happening. The landscape in South African electricity has changed. So we need to be able to use this year, which is the last year of the MYPD4, use this last year to design something that will be better, that will yield better prices, that is with far more predictable prices, that will send correct signals to everybody, to the licensee, as well as correct signals to the consumers. But it's starting. The process is starting. We are actually as NERSA, we have contracted a service provider, and we are only going to be starting with the actual work from the 1st of March.
Mr. Gumede,
with a view that we should conclude it latest in August.
Were there any other alternatives that Eskom perhaps could have considered? And I'm asking this because we all know what the situation is like in the country. There's a jobs bloodbath. We have astronomically high unemployment rates in this country. You pointed out earlier that we are very much also dealing with legacy issues that we can't get away from, of people who have made of services that they haven't paid for in the past. But be that as it may, as much as it's clear that Eskom is cash-strapped, the broader public themselves are also cash-strapped at this point. So were there any other possible avenues that could have been maneuvered to try and cushion this blow?
Look, our view, I think my answer to that would clearly have been a yes, in this way. This is our view is a simple one. That simple says, when you've got and unfortunately, we differ with Eskom on this one. That says, firstly, their view is that the electricity price in South Africa is too low, so it needs to go up. We unfortunately back to differ considerably on that. But it's something that we need to prove going forward. That's number one, through numbers. Number two, we do believe that in any commodity, like I was saying, we set revenue. Revenue has got a price and it's got volume or sales. Those sales is basically are the consumers saying, yes, I'm prepared to buy, but I'm only prepared to buy your commodity at a particular price. Now, unfortunately, what we then say, ideally what we should have done, or what should be done, is we should be able to compute a number, a tariff number, which consumers would be able to say, at this price, I'm prepared to buy, I can afford it. But then, unfortunately, when you take that price and you multiply it with the sales, you get a particular revenue number. Then there would be a difference between the revenue number that you compute and the revenue number that is sought by the licensee. We should then be able to say, ideally, we need to then say, look, because there was malfeasance, there was whatever, perhaps that should be covered differently. In fact, in business, what you would have done is to write off that you can't collect from your customers. But because this is owned by the state, perhaps the shareholders also sometimes come into the party. There must be write-offs as well. But that is how, in a normal, if we're dealing with a normal commodity here, that's how it would have been done. So the shareholder would have come to the party, and there should have been write-offs as well. Some costs should have been carried by the licensee through impairments of assets and things like that. That is normal course of business.
So, and that's an interesting point that you make, Mr. Gumede, because if we look at write-offs in terms of what Eskom has written off, again, where is the benefit to the consumer?
Unfortunately, the consumer at the end of the day, because either the consumer pays via tax, or it pays by money that was expended, but they don't get a value from it. Because, for instance, one of the things, the biggest item in terms of price setting is capital. So you would find that instead of recognizing capital for Medupi, for instance, at 50 billion, you recognize the capital at 250 billion. When you give a return on that, as you can see, the numbers get astronomical. Now, what you then say is that now the consumer pays for that, but it was not party to the decision to procure a particular plant at 4 or 5 times what it would have normally cost. Now, where does the consumer get? Unfortunately, the consumer doesn't have any benefit in that. And except that if it's written off, of course, then at least it would not translate into a tariff. But yes, of course, it would have been consumer money that was spent. But at least if it doesn't have a double whammy of having spent money, and then of course now the tariff goes up, and therefore and they end up being out of jobs because, for instance, I was engaging with the smelters yesterday, and they're telling me that 2/3 of the mineral beneficiation capacity of some of the key minerals in South Africa is actually lying idle because the electricity price is just too high. It's just too high for them.
And then we speak of, as things that you've mentioned, that you've touched on. For example, the cost of coal, which they had to, as Eskom, also give account on yesterday in Parliament. But there are other factors as well that come into play. And there are many. Again, we can go on listing them forever and a day. But the point is, you now have this consumer who is looking at these billions and billions of rands that we keep talking about. Last year, for example, Mr. Gumede, NERSA approved 13.3 billion rand. That was for, I think it was for the clearing account, Eskom's clearing account.
Correct.
And what has happened to that? Because, again, it's a shortfall in Eskom's books. And we are again recovering from the public. So you acknowledge that as the regulator, that there were certain governance failures at Eskom. Again, they are well documented. How is this fair on ordinary South Africans?
Unfortunately, the cost of corruption touches almost everybody. I mean, the challenge we are facing is that we have a new management at Eskom, and there were monies that were borrowed that needs to be repaid. Whether those monies were borrowed properly and people that benefited from that, perhaps they've walked away with the money. But the issue is that this is now sitting in the balance sheet of Eskom. It needs to be repaid. Now, the question is, why should it be repaid by people who didn't actually expend that money? It's unfortunate. Those are the, how do I put this? Those are the sad parts around corruption, because it's the ones that benefited the least that end up having to pay the most, and those that benefited from this are walking away with billions of rands in their pockets and smiling. Now, the consumer is not going to pay. The consumer is not benefiting from it. But unfortunately, the costs were incurred. Now, ours is to say, can we strike a balance here between, and it can only come from a conversation with Eskom and other stakeholders, and say, yes, those monies were paid. Yes, South Africa or the Eskom balance sheet, there is money that's sitting there that needs to be repaid. Now, How do we best do it in a manner that does not destroy the economy, does not impoverish the already poor consumers? So that balance, unfortunately, can only come through a conversation. But we can't wish away the past. We need to be able to work with that past.
On that very somber and sour note, I think we'll leave it, Mr. Gumede. We are out of time. Nhlanhla Gumede is from NERSA, explaining to us why South Africans will have to pay that 15.63% increase in electricity from April this year. And you heard him say, I think Mr. Gumede said, we are now sitting at a point where we're paying 134 cents. That's 134 per kilowatt hour of electricity, and that is not retail. That is what Eskom is paying. So you and I, as consumers, are going to pay a lot more. So please send us your views at Morning Live SABC. But